So I've just come across an article which has caught my attention, and I wanted to read a bit further to find out if there was a bit more to it. The headline, as is often the case, was a little bit misleading, um, and the headline was that men in France will be fined for sexist comments. Now, on the surface, my first reaction was, well, that's who gets to define sexism? Who gets to define a sexist comment? Now, when I click the article, which is in the London Times, it reads €350 fines take the wind out of France's serial wolf whistlers. Now, that's a bit different from a sexist statement. So it irritates me the way the media does this. They have kind of clickbait headlines, and you get this across the media spectrum, left and right. But anyway, this is what the article says. I'm going to read out a bit. I can't read all of it because you need to be, subscribed permanently online. I can buy the Times as a raw newspaper, but I'm not subscribed to it online. Anyway, I'll read out the first few sentences. Sexist remarks would be punished in France with spot fines of €90 that could rise almost four times that amount under plans to curb macho behaviour. Five MPs commissioned by the centrist government to prepare a bill outlawing male chauvinism in public will call for a new offence of sexist outrage in a report due out this month. That's in inverted commas, sexist outrage. Elise Fagels, I don't know how her name is pronounced, one of the MPs said the offences would be punishable with a Class 4 fine, which is €90 if paid on the spot, €135 if settled within 2 weeks, and €350 after that. Now, five MPs have signed this, and a government minister, I believe she's the youngest minister in Emmanuel Macron's government, she's only 34, um, Marlene Schiappa. She's described as a blogger and novelist at the heart of Emmanuel Macron's government. She's proposing fines of up to €5,000 on the grounds that will make them think twice. And there's a very lengthy article on that in the Guardian. There's a few things I want to say about this. Firstly, I am very, very wary of any sort of legislation regarding speech, period. I think it needs to be very closely scrutinised. And there is some irony in this coming from the country that, espoused the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. A big part of liberty, of course, is freedom of expression. Now, I think those of us who are wary of this need to be careful that we're not defending boorish behaviour. I have very little sympathy for some guy who's. I digress somewhat from those who say that wolf whistling is harmless. I don't think it is. In the end of the day, you don't really have any right to wolf whistle a stranger, a young woman, if you find her attractive. You know, I don't think it's harmless behaviour. I think it's inappropriate, and I think it's potentially intimidating. So I don't agree with those who say that wolf whistling is harmless. And there are probably too many men and a large number of women who suggest that. I don't think it is harmless. I mean, put it this way, if your sister or your girlfriend was walking home at night, and it's always a cliche that's attached with builders, but it could be other men as well, and they wolf whistle, from their point of view, it might be harmless, but how is she supposed to know that that wouldn't escalate? So I don't agree that it's harmless. I think it's wrong. Maybe a fine would be a deterrent for that sort of behaviour. But what I am wary of is language policing and legislation behind that. So if this is purely about wolf whistling, I don't really have a problem with that. But I do think that the feminist movement in the Western world, I mean, France, to be fair, is probably a more conservative culture in terms of, I think probably men would get away with more in France than they would in Canada, Britain, or the United States. That's my gut feeling. But we've seen similar examples. I mean, in the UK, it was either last year or the year before, Nottinghamshire police was talking about criminalising misogynistic behaviour, whatever that means. The problem is who gets to define these abstract terms? I mean, misogyny is hatred of women and girls, right? How do you criminalise something like that? It's just stupid. I don't understand how you criminalise an attitude. I think there definitely needs to be, I don't want to say education because that implies that these men they're not educated. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think sometimes they are educated, but they're just boorish, you know. I mean, this club in London, it's attracted controversy. The President's Club, where apparently it was a men-only club and hostesses were paid to perform sexy dances. Clearly, that's wrong. I mean, no one should rationally try and condone that. So I wouldn't go along with the opinion that there isn't a problem out there. I think there is. And I think as men, we need to be honest and say that there is a problem out there. But what I will challenge is this idea that sexist attitudes come only from men. And once again, it comes down to a question of, well, take for example in this country this thing about misogyny. If you're going to criminalize misogyny, criminalize misandry as well. You know, women in public life have made very sweeping statements about men and basically got away with it. There was criticism, but they were absolutely not reprimanded in a way that a man would be. Andrea Leadsom, who's a government minister, said something to the effect that all men who look after children are potential predators. That caused a lot of anger, and from what I recall, she made a half groveling apology, but she kept her job. Now, you'd be hard pushed to find a man in government say something similar, you know, make a sweeping statement demonizing all women and keep his job. So I think if something that really angers a lot of us who are critical of third wave feminism is the blatant double standards. No one can rationally dispute that there are double standards. So when you get, I mean, this minister quoted Emmanuel Macron for saying that he was a feminist. I haven't heard that quote, but it's a thing nowadays for men in politics, especially progressive men, whether it be Emmanuel Macron, Nick Clegg, Justin Trudeau. It's almost like a trend to say they're feminists, and yet they're likely to be far more in line with virtue signaling to Western feminists than they are to condemn honor killings or women used as weapons of war in the Democratic Republic of Congo. What concerns me is that when all of this is backed up by legislation, when we're talking about language policing, there are some really legitimate issues of concern there. Because I don't know how you criminalize an abstract idea like misogyny. Of course, misogyny is a terrible thing, but how do you get to define it? I mean, the feminist movement throws that word around so that a man criticizing a feminist is a misogynist, right? So that if you don't believe that the gender pay gap is anywhere near the way that feminists are making it out to be, oh, that's misogyny. Basically, misogyny is whatever they say it is. That's dangerous because it's this totalitarian control of language, and that should be very concerning for anybody. For anybody, women should be concerned about it as well because it's being done in their name, and they're being treated like helpless children. Um, so I do think in some ways Western feminism is out of control in terms of its rush to criminalize everything. So to be clear, I don't think that catcalling and wolf whistling is totally harmless, and I would disagree with those who say that it is. I don't think it is. And maybe there's nothing wrong with having some legislation in that regard if it is a serious problem in France, as perhaps it is. But I do think that we have to be very wary whenever you're talking about legislating language. No matter how offensive something is, when you start to legislate that, it becomes a slippery slope, in my opinion. Now, there's clearly certain common sense incidents, and perhaps I'm going off on a tangent here. Say, for example, you get a drunk shouting out racial slurs at an ethnic minority person on a train. I say throw the book at them. I've no sympathy for that sort of person. That's thuggish and intimidating behaviour. So I've no sympathy for that sort of thing. But the problem is the identity politics movement, to give an umbrella term, they don't seem to differentiate between cases of blatant abuse and opinions that they simply disagree with. That's a real problem because they put someone like Jordan Peterson in the same camp as some sort of racist thug. They don't differentiate. And that is deeply concerning because anyone with common sense can see that there's a world of difference between someone like Jordan Peterson, if they actually listen to what he's saying, and racist thugs or men who really do have regressive attitudes towards women. Um, what's interesting is, and I don't want to go too much off on a tangent here, but identity politics people are notably silent when it comes to grime music. I mean, grime music arguably is full of misogyny. It's full of glorifying gang culture and treating women as commodities. Why are they silent about that? It's could it be that it happens to be popular among young black men, therefore it would go against their identity politics narrative because to criticize it would then be racist. These are things that people need to think about. I mean, what really bothers me is the double standards of these sort of issues. I'm not suggesting that women catcall and wolf whistle in the same way, but you do get sexist women. You do get women who, I mean, take for example in the UK, we have a subculture here of ladette behaviour. You get loud, obnoxious, aggressive women, and believe me, when they are drunk, they are just as problematic as drunk men. I think it's a mistake to think that because women are generally physically weaker, they cannot be a problem. Ask any doorman what it's like to deal with a drunk woman, and I think he will say it is a bloody nightmare. Um, because not only is he facing, he needs to tread carefully in terms of physically restraining her, but that's why it's probably a good thing to have door women as well, because you have that mitigates this risk factor. But in the case of a drunk man, he just has to throw the guy out. He's not going to be accused of rape. In the case of a drunk woman, she could resent the fact that she's been thrown out of the club. She could, say, "Oh, he sexually assaulted me." Now, don't get me wrong, there is a real problem out there, but I am concerned about the way this thing has snowballed since the whole Harvey Weinstein thing. I really am. And I'm not the only one. I think many people are concerned about just how much this thing has snowballed. I think that says one of two things. A, there is a real problem out there, which I believe there is, but also that it is now being thrown around to the point whereby there may be some people settling old scores. It's conceivable. Um, I mean, Liam Neeson, well-respected actor, he gave a very measured response to this. He was asked about it, I believe it was on RTE, the Irish network, and he cited an acting friend. And apparently, this friend had been talking to an actress, a female friend, and she was talking to him about some emotionally turbulent experience she'd had. I don't know if it was a breakup with a boyfriend or something like that. Can't remember exactly, but you can find this video on YouTube. But apparently, she started crying, and being a friend, he instinctively just put his hand on her back to sort of reassure her, as people do. And because her back, she had a sort of open seam top, he happened to touch her bare back without really thinking about it. But in no way, based on what Liam Neeson was describing, in no way was that intended to be sexualized. It was just a friend trying to comfort his friend in a totally innocent way. Well, at the time, he immediately apologized and said, "Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to do that." He even apparently sent her an email to reassert his apology, that nothing was meant by it. He was just trying to comfort her. And she apparently said, "Oh, it's fine. Don't worry about it." A month later, he got a legal notification that he was being sued for sexual harassment. Now, that might be an extreme example, but I imagine there are other cases out there that are like that. And we now have a situation where men are basically being punished on allegations alone. Alone, nothing else, just allegations. Casey Affleck's been dropped from the Oscars because of allegations around him. Apparently, he was going to read out the Best Actress list. I think that's really problematic when people are being punished on allegations alone. For goodness sake, let's start to see some trials. If people are facing serious allegations, let them have their day in court. For everyone's sake. What concerns me is a large degree of common sense has gone away in all of this. I do think there is a degree of a witch hunt going on here. Now, Liam Neeson wasn't saying that there isn't a problem, and he went on to say he's heard of terrible stories in the work that he does. I believe he's a ambassador for, I forget the charity, but he mentioned that he hears of stories, for example, of female labourers in certain parts of the world, and the stories that you hear are heartbreaking. The sort of abuse that they put up with, that they have no choice but to put up with. So I think there are a lot of legitimate questions, but one thing I think we need to challenge is this idea that when a man is accused, then suddenly he is pilloried, he is vilified, and it's automatically a case of he is guilty because of the allegations. And we've lost sight of the fact that allegations are allegations, not a guilty verdict. And if anyone thinks that those who say things like, "Oh, I believe women and these men must be guilty," I would reverse that and say, well, there has been examples of women who lie. There have. I may have mentioned this before, but there was a case in Britain a few years ago where a man brushed against a woman. I believe it was Waterloo train station in London. Very busy train station. People brush past others all the time. And the Crown Prosecution Service actually brought it to court. They went out of their way to try and prosecute this man. He was eventually cleared when common sense prevailed and CCTV footage showed that he had simply brushed past her by accident. There was no sexual contact whatsoever, and this well known actress, who was not named, was determined to destroy this man's life. I think it's a disgrace. I think she should have been prosecuted for perverting the course of justice. That's how I felt about that. I mean, there has to be a degree of common sense in all of this. As a man, I acknowledge that there are sleazy scumbags out there. There are. There are men who don't know their limit. There are men who will cross a red line. I totally accept that and I condemn it unreservedly. But we have to have a degree of common sense. And it makes me angry that this is getting a bit out of control. We're now in a situation, like I say, where any man in public life basically has to be ultra, ultra careful. And I think we're going to see a situation because of as a consequence of all of this, where you're going to see a puritanism. You're going to see men in public life will no longer compliment women. They will no longer, there was a tradition in award ceremonies where you would give, a man would give an innocent sort of peck on the cheek. But this is something that's been done for decades. That's going to be dropped. women are never going to be complimented. And then they'll turn around and complain and say, oh, men never notice me. The truth is, this witch hunt thing is going to scare men. And there's no problem if it's scaring the actual sleazebags, that's fine. But the problem is, innocent men are going to get caught up in it. And I think that's a real problem. Um, so, yeah, I didn't intend this video to be so long. But I just ask people to really, really think about these issues because this will affect everyone. It will affect men because they could potentially be falsely accused of things, and they're going to be ultra careful around women to the point where there's going to be no romance. Let me just say it, there's going to be no romance because men will no longer want to compliment women because they'll think, oh, I'm going to be accused of harassment. Um, and for those who say, oh, but harassment is, it isn't about that, that's the problem. It's not being clearly defined, right? So harassment should be defined as on inappropriate sexual contact and innuendo, but I think it's not being clearly defined so that if a man even compliments a woman, that's being classed as harassment. And I'm not talking about, you know, like show me your tits, love, which is clearly wrong, but even something that is intended as totally innocent. And there are many examples of situations that were totally taken out of context. Um, and it's going to affect women as well because they're then going to find it harder to get male attention. Men aren't going to go up to them in clubs, they're not going to pay attention to them because they're going to be thinking, well, I'll think twice about that. You know, men are traditionally expected to make the first move. Now, how can men do that when they're going to be thinking, I'll be accused of sexual harassment? Where do you draw the line with this? Where is the common sense? So, anyway, I've thrown out a lot of ideas there. I invite people to discuss this and let me know your thoughts. Thanks for watching.